Another community favorite that's made her place in most modern rosters of Metarock games very clear since her debut, it is FSL00 Fancyroll, with a kit of Virus, Hammer, Napalm, Flight Legs, and the leg ability of Mascot, which upon being attacked will debuff the success and power of the attacker upon the end of the turn. Now, much like Fancy Ale, who first debuted on Metarock S's launch, Fancyroll, as the first model of the FSL series, of course, is essentially a Fancy Ale light. But despite having that title, she still has a very solid scattered kit, essentially, that she can make use of very solidly if used correctly. Virus is a turn-skipping technique that if used correctly and you catch a foe in their heat phase, i.e. you outrun them to the line, you can force them into turn skip, which means that they can no longer complete their turn when they get to the line, and basically waste the entirety of that turn, having to run back and get another order before they can even do anything. Hammer is a standard melee attack that is a full AoE, meaning that upon attacking the target, it will damage all 4 parts of the enemy at once and spread the damage equally among all of them. And then, of course, the left arm is Napalm, is a gunpowder-based move that upon attack will damage 1 part normally and 2 other parts at random at 1/3 of your total damage. So again, a very scattered kit overall, predominantly an AoE fighter more or less. So Fancyroll's role in battle is not going to be your dedicated nuker or your dedicated fighter, as more or less her role on the field is auxiliary melee support, as you can basically use her as a way to kind of whittle down the opponent ahead of time and then have someone come up behind her and just lay on that nuke for multi-part breaking, which with Hammer and Napalm is decently easy to use if you can use it relatively quickly and relatively easily. Flight Legs, of course, also mean that Fancyroll has very high natural mobility and decent coverage on most terrains, and the Mascot ability does also provide that haunting spite, essentially, for anyone that does choose to attack her, and that debuff will basically haunt the attacker for the remainder of the battle, essentially as long as Fancyroll is alive. So, spite fighter, dedicated melee support, more or less. As a pure set overall, I would rate her a pretty solid 7 out of 10, because the few times I have faced her in battle, she does have very high mobility, as I mentioned with the Flight Legs, but she also has relatively high heat stats as well, which means even for her head like Virus, it is very, very easy for her to outrun you to the line if she's on terrains that she's good at. In this case, Desert and Wasteland are two of the primary ones that Flight Legs are the best on, which means she can make herself a very recurring pain in the neck very easily and very quickly if you do not handle her or have a way to kind of counteract the Virus issue. Otherwise, she's going to be pretty much crippling you right from square one before even the nukers can go behind and finish the job. As mixed parts score, I would rate her about a 7.5 out of 10 for that very solid balance across all the parts. Flight Legs you can generally never go wrong with, very high mobility, decent coverage. Unfortunately, no heavy support, so no heavy parts allowed essentially if you're going to use her. Virus, of course, you can never go wrong with. It's always encouraged to have it somewhere on the team, as you can make use of it very quickly, very easily, and the high heat stat on the head also will prove incredibly invaluable at the end of the day. Melee and Hammer and Napalm you probably won't use as often, but in the sense that you do end up having to use Fancyroll for whatever reason that may be, it's honestly a good idea to have her raised to 3-star just as a backup, as kind of like that precautionary measure more than anything else. But at the end of the day, Fancyroll is a pretty solid model, pretty solid melee support, as I mentioned, high mobility, generally can't go wrong, and you really won't be sorry with raising her just for the sake of having her on standby.